Good afternoon. My name is Marc Ozawa. I'm a researcher in the research division at the NATO Defense College. I'm going to be giving a talk today on what I think is a very important topic on NATO-Russia relations. And before I begin, I just wanted to say that these are my own views and they do not represent those of NATO or the NATO Defense College. With that being said, hopefully this talk will be more interesting for you and for me. So I think the starting point in understanding NATO-Russia relations is to answer the question, what is the state of relations today? And it would probably come as no surprise to any of you that relations now are very tense. There is a very low degree of trust, a lot of suspicion. And, to put this in simple terms, NATO and Russia are not really on normal speaking terms, I guess you could say. Limited communication does take place within the environment of the NATO-Russia Council, but even those talks have been much more limited in recent years. And the talks that do take place in the NATO-Russia Council and at the ministerial level are primarily focused on deconfliction. So trying to make sure that there are no misunderstandings between both sides and what they're doing, their actions on the ground, and to try and reduce the level of tension in their interactions. But there are no more staff-to-staff talks between NATO and Russia, at least officially. It's as a bit of background to understanding NATO-Russia relations, the current structure institutionally between NATO and Russia is within what's known as the NATO-Russia Founding Acts. From the late 90s. And within that structure, technically and officially, Russia is a partner of NATO. But ever since 2014, that partnership and what it entails has all been put on hold. Why has it been put on hold? You may probably guess that it has something to do with what happened in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, the aftermath of Maidan and the ensuing war, that conflict that took place in the Donbas region and Russia's involvement. This was a showstopper for NATO because it violated international law. It violated international norms that have been in place, territorial and sovereignty norms that have been in place since 1945 in the post-war period. And for NATO, this is a very important point because NATO is an organization of values and principles. This is what, yes, NATO is a collective security and defense organization. All of the member states receive security and defense assurances through their membership, but what unites them also is an agreement on a set of values, norms, and principles. and what took place in 2014 was a stark violation of that. And this leads me to the point of what, and here I have to stress, this is my view. This leads me to the point of what I think is a fundamental impasse in interactions between NATO and Russia. I've just explained to you, I've given you one example of what happened in 2014 that illustrates NATO and its members' perspectives on Russia's actions from NATO's perspective. This is certainly not Russia's perspective. I won't go into details about Russia's perspective, about what Russia's perspective is or may have been on the situation in Crimea and why they moved forward with the annexation of Crimea. But I will say that Russia does not view NATO as a collective security and defense organization that values sovereignty and where every member state has a voice, and in which decisions are arrived at by consensus. If you can characterize it this way, I would say simply that the Russian perspective on what NATO is an extension of American power in Europe. And Russia's perspective on NATO is partially formed through the experience of the Cold War and partially formed through a view of how the international system operates. That there are, it's very much sort of a realist perspective on states and the international system, meaning that there is a hierarchy of states established by how powerful those states are. And some states have a more privileged position than other states. And this perspective, as may be clear to you, flies in the face of the values and principles that guide NATO. So you have two sides that are approaching a conflict from very different foundational perspectives, and it's difficult for them to communicate and see eye to eye, not only on this issue, but on a host of other issues. I mentioned the historical context of the Cold War, and this point cannot be impressed enough. For the better part of NATO's history, throughout the entire Cold War, NATO was an organization from the then Soviet Union's perspective that was, by definition, pitted against the Soviet Union. And considering that most of Russian leadership today came of age, meaning they came into their professional careers still during the Cold War, their worldviews were very much shaped by those events and those perceptions of NATO and its members. So that's to give you a very brief overview of the different perspectives between NATO and Russia on how the international environment works and what each other's role is in relation to NATO from Russia's perspective or to Russia from NATO's perspective. Having said this, there have been cycles of cooperation between Russia and NATO. Those of you who may be familiar with the history may have heard of the honeymoon period between the West and Russia following the immediately end of the Cold War. And at the time, there were discussions taking place within NATO about NATO's raison d'être in a post-Cold War world. That's one side of the coin. But what happened in the late 90s was, in my view, the first point of conflict between NATO and Russia in the late 90s in the context of the war in Yugoslavia and NATO's involvement in the bombing of NATO's activities in general in that conflict and in that war, particularly directed against Serbia, which is historically an ally of Russia going back even before the Cold War. That was the first point of conflict, at least from from Russia's perspective, or the first disappointment. There was, following the election of Vladimir Putin in his first term, I would say that this was a point of another period of optimism between NATO and Russia. There was even talk of potential Russian membership in NATO. And but shortly, that didn't happen. It's a very interesting historical period of study, which I can't go into now, but for a variety of reasons, it didn't happen. And then in 2004 and 2005, there was the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And this raised some red flags among some NATO member states about Russia's intentions. And keep in mind, during this period, there was a lot of optimism about NATO and Russia cooperation. NATO and Russia were interacting with each other under the structure of the NATO-Russia Founding Act, meaning that they considered each other partners. But the Orange Revolution was probably the first red flag. Then the second big red flag from NATO's perspective was the Russo-Georgian War in 2008. But cooperation continued. And throughout this time, I wouldn't say that there was no suspicion on either side. There certainly was, but not enough to substantively change their cooperation and interactions. Up until that point, jumping ahead of myself a little bit there, I want to give you one example of cooperation between NATO and Russia that was taking place, which is for me very tangible and real. I mentioned that I work at the NATO Defense College. We have course members coming from different member states. We have course members also coming from different partnership countries. And until 2014, there were actually course members or students in course members, which we refer to them within the college, coming from Russia. So there was even that degree of cooperation. And all of this ended in 2014. So there have been cycles of cooperation, but 2014 was really a watershed moment. Some of you may have heard of NATO's two-prong or dual-track approach to relations with Russia, including deterrence and dialogue. I think the deterrent side is probably much more familiar to you. What may be less familiar is the efforts to maintain meaningful dialogue between NATO and Russia. That happened primarily within the structure of the NATO-Russia Council, and there were direct staff-to-staff meetings and communications. And like I said, this all ended in 2014. I realize that that I've run out of time now. I just want to make sure that I've impressed all of the points that I wanted to make. There are different views about dialogue and how to deal with Russia in the current environment within NATO. Different states have different views, and that's fine. However, the consensus as it stands right now is that 2014 was serious enough of an offense not to change this approach right now, meaning that limited communication and the putting on hold of partnership interactions should remain in place. Is change possible? Can the situation improve? It looks doubtful right now, but if relations can be improved, it will probably be initiated by states within the alliance and work its way up to NATO-wide discussions. This has not happened yet. There also have not been overtures that I'm aware of, any substantive, credible overtures from Russia to re-engage in any meaningful way a change in relations or interactions with NATO. But that being said, I'm reminded of a period in history when things also seemed pretty dire between the West and Russia. This was during the early 1960s, at the height of the Cold War, and in the fallout of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It took some time, but there was eventually a transition from a point of high tension to détente. I can't go into the details of that case right now, but it's an interesting period, I believe, to study, to find out what may or may not be applicable to the state of affairs today. Thank you for listening to me today. I hope that was informative, and do feel free, if you have any follow-up questions, to contact me at the NATO Defense College. Thanks very much.